and education for the Community Oncology Alliance Patient Advocacy Network. As you can see from our starting photos, I'm very excited today to have a practicing medical oncologist, Dr. Dinesh Kapur, who is from Eastern Connecticut Hematology and Oncology in Southeastern Connecticut, as our special guest today. In addition to taking care of cancer patients all day, he's also the clinical research director and the medical director at ECHO, which is the acronym for Eastern Connecticut Hematology and Oncology. And he is also very, very well known in the national oncology landscape. And I'm very excited about having him as our guest today. And we're going to go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So I always start by giving you a few updates about what's going on with COA and what's going on with CPAN. The most important thing that I'm excited about sharing right now is, now that we're somewhat coming out of COVID, and I know we're still all dealing with COVID, from a event standpoint, I'm excited to share that several of our CPAN chapters are going back to live events, and we do have CPAN chapters across the country, including at the Cancer Center, where our doctors from stay, Eastern Connecticut Hematology and Oncology. So that's really good news. If you want to learn more about some of our live events, feel free to check out our COA and CPAN webpage. So today I've asked Dr. Kapur to start by telling us about his own personal background as a medical oncologist, because even though he has all these huge titles and does really great work, the most important work that he probably does, I'm sure he will say, outside of being a husband and father, I guess would be his work taking care of cancer patients. So I've asked him to really start with some of the basics about what conversations look like between a newly diagnosed patient and their oncologist, who becomes such an important person in their care. He's also going to really zone in on, there's many components of care that oncologists are involved with. But for today's topic, again, this May is National Clinical Trials Research Month. He's going to talk about the role of community oncology in clinical trials, and really the kind of conversations that patients and doctors have, because what's really amazing to me is that there's still so many misconceptions about the accessibility of clinical trials and where you can get a clinical trial. And Dr. Kapur has also taken on another leadership responsibility. In addition to all those titles I just gave you, he's also now playing a key role with an organization called OneOncology, which is another organization that's made up of community oncology practices. Next slide, please. So before we get to hear Dr. Kapur, as we were doing our little background talking and our little pre-chat, he was noting that he liked the background. So this is a background in ECHO. And I absolutely like the background, but I love the message, a beacon of light on your cancer journey. And that's really what patients look for when they go to a cancer center. So Dr. Kapur, welcome. Thank you for being with us today. And I would like to ask you to tell us about your personal background and also about the background of Eastern Connecticut Hematology and Oncology.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rose, for those very, very kind words. You've always been a great proponent for us in Southeastern and Northeastern Connecticut, and as a community practice that is still independent. So thank you again. And obviously, we've known each other for so many years that it seems that, to see you and your journey and to see ECHO's journey in these years is very gratifying to me. So I'll just briefly talk about the practice first, and then I'll talk about myself for maybe a minute or so, and then I'm going to throw the audience a question, and I'll let you collect the responses if possible. Our practice was started in 1985 by one physician, Dr. Slater, who moved in from Memorial Sloan Kettering. And he moved into Southeastern Connecticut, and he was the first person who actually brought Southeastern Connecticut into the realm of clinical trials. So really, it was his vision to expand clinical trials in the communities. He started off as a single practitioner, and I was the fourth person to join the practice. And now we are up to 7 oncologists and 6 APRNs. We have a staff of probably 65 employees. Our research department is a dedicated research department with 7 full-time equivalent people in the research department. And from starting off from a very small research footprint as a private practice, currently with all the trials that we have something like 30 odd clinical trials open in our practice, which are from anywhere from phase 1B to phase 4. And we also have just-in-time clinical trials that we are very proud of. So now we first started off doing trials with the intergroups. So when we had ECOG and SABP, we also did it with GOG and RTOG. And we would do it with either UConn or with Tufts. And then eventually we realized that the organizations felt that we were better off getting those designations ourselves. So as a private practice, we applied for those and were able to get that. Over time, as you start doing clinical trials, you realize that there's a lot more open in the world of oncology and hematology and thrombosis, and you need to get them. Most of the time, we felt that we want to bring in the phase 2 and the phase 3 clinical trials for our patients. And now we are getting the phase 1B clinical trials as well. The phase 1, the pure phase 1s we haven't done yet in our practice. We are one of the highest accruers in most of the clinical trials that we start off with. In fact, with our OneOncology affiliation, we are doing a trial with Roche Genentech, and from a small practice standpoint, we have enrolled probably the maximum number of patients, apart from Tennessee Oncology, into those clinical trials. And that's a basket of clinical trials looking at molecular alterations and variations. So coming to myself, after finishing off my fellowship at University of Connecticut, I actually went into academia for a while and did clinical trials in thrombosis and hemostasis before coming into echo. And the first thing you realize when you come to private practice is that this is yours, and the more you put in, the better results you can get for your patients. And each doctor in our practice had an expertise. And one by one, we added on to the expertise. And each person that has joined us subsequently has also had an interest in different disease states. And we really encourage people who join us to be involved or have the interest in doing clinical trials. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So that's about me. Just became a grandfather for the first time. So very excited about that. So that's another title that I have now.
Right.
So that's the fun part in my life. But Rose is absolutely correct that from our standpoint, when I look at the delivery of oncology care in communities, we feel that it is highly imperative and important for private clinics and community oncology practices and clinics to be able to have the resources put in so that they can do clinical trials for their patients. And it does a lot of things. One, you're bringing cutting edge medicine into your own practice. Two, the patients don't have to travel long distances. And three, it keeps the staff engaged. And it is really exciting getting all the new therapeutic modalities coming to us in oncology, which keeps on changing almost on a daily basis from my standpoint. So I would like to actually throw a question out to the audience and see how many folks on this call are currently doing clinical trials, number one. And number two, what are the roadblocks that they faced? And number three, what are the apprehensions and the fears that they have? And any other question that they can throw at me before we move on with the presentation?
Yes.
So I'll give people a minute to really look into that.
Yeah, and you can type into the chat box, which is at the bottom of the screen. Many of you see, and I will keep looking down at that to see if anybody wants to respond to those three questions. And while you're thinking about that, whether you're a practice or an individual who had any of those challenges, that'll be insightful for all of us because this is an educational forum. And while you're thinking about that, while they're thinking, Dr. Kapur, and possibly type into the chat box, I did want to ask you some questions about some of the comments you made just to help us all understand. And by the way, for the audience, Dr. Kapur really likes to be interactive. So if you hear me leaning in with a question, please understand I'm not interrupting him. I have his encouragement to ask these questions. So you talked about the different stages of trials and what's offered, from phase one to, or not offered. So can you explain the different phases of trials? And then while you're answering that question, I will look at the question that just came through in the chat.
So come again with the question again, Rose.
So you mentioned the different types of trials. So you said you don't do very many phase 1 trials. So if you can explain why certain cancer centers offer phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, and what the difference is to a patient, or what that means to a patient, because they're not oncologists, so they don't use this terminology.
Absolutely. So, most of the clinical trials, so phase 1 trials are looking at safety of medications, the real classic phase 1s, because what you don't want to do is you don't want to cause patients to have any harm. And that's the classical phase 1, that whether the medication is safe for patients. And then you can extrapolate that into phase 1 and phase 1Bs, in which the medicines are safe, but are they effective? And then the second phase 2 trials are that the medicine is being tried for a specific disease to see if the medicine is working. Phase 3 trials are that you're comparing this new medicine with the current standard of care, and you're matching and seeing, is the current standard of care better than the new medicine that you're trying, or is the new medicine or new therapeutic modality that you're trying, is that better than your current existing approaches or the standard of care? And phase 4 are generally post-marketing trials. So the medication has been approved, it is safe, it has been vetted, and now you're going in and saying, okay, we've used the medicine, and now we want to see how is this medicine being taken by the patients and by the communities. So that's how the phase 1, 2, 3, 4 is. Most of the private practices or community practices have a hard time doing classical phase 1 trials, because you have to keep patients in the office or in an infusion suite or in a makeshift unit for at least 23 hours. Yes. You also have to do a lot of pharmacokinetics on these patients. So we have done phase 1B trials, not the classical phase 1s, but we've done the phase 1B trials in which we keep the patients in the office for up to 12 to 14 hours when we need to do the pharmacokinetics of the new medication that we are using on them.
Thank you for explaining that to us. So we do have we have a couple of responses to your questions. So I'll start with the first question. And excuse me one second, that just disappeared from my screen for just a moment. So one of the questions is that we're currently matching for clinical trials, and one of the biggest barriers is physician responses or willingness to enroll the patients. So how would you respond to that?
So I would assume that the clinical trial is open in your facility, and you somebody is a PI, and now you have a trial open. That's what I would assume. And if the trial is open in your facility, then it should not be an issue at all. And I'll tell you why. You encourage the physicians by educating them, but also providing them with resources from your research department standpoint. Okay. You can't be just putting all the work on the clinician who's going through the patients on a daily basis, seeing their schedule on a daily basis, but you need to put in all the supportive pieces in your practice as far as research department is concerned. So we actually have a very good research department with 7 dedicated employees who do this for us. So they will actually do the screening, they will do the matching, they will do all the eligibility criteria, etc., whatever testing needs to be done, and the follow-ups, etc., for the patient. So the load on the clinician is very little. Right. And that's how you succeed. We also have a way of enrolling patients on clinical trials. One is every new patient who comes to the practice, they are screened for eligibility for any clinical trial that we may have open, number one. If a patient is changing therapy, we'll look at that time from our nursing staff in the infusion area. We'll pick it up and say, okay, we are changing this. So they will go to the research folks and say, we are having a change in therapy. Is there a clinical trial open? Or the clinician might say, is there a clinical trial open? Then you have supportive care trials for the patients, etc. So that's how you actually engage your clinicians, by not putting in more administrative burden on them, but minimizing the administrative burden and using their expertise in the disease while all the other work is being done by the research department.
Thank you, Dr. Kapur. And moving on to the next question or comment is, one big barrier is getting time with oncologists to discuss the pros and cons of different trials that you have on a list.
Well, again, we will open clinical trials based on the needs of our patients. And we do not open trials just willy-nilly, as I would say. We are very focused on the kind of clinical trials that we will open in our practice. In our practice, out of the 7 doctors that we have, probably 5 like to specialize in, we all see everything in oncology, but we all like to also specialize in 1 or 2 disease states. So like we have a doctor who specializes in breast cancer and palliative care. We have another one who specializes in thrombosis and hemostasis. I like to do a lot of GI malignancies and immunotherapy. There's another doctor who does head and neck cancer and lung cancer. So this way we have been able to split our responsibilities in the practice as well. And that's how you are able to build a team which is now going to be able to do clinical trials on a regular basis. Now, I'll be honest with you, when we first started doing clinical trials, it was not easy for us. We had to put in the resources, we had to have a buy-in from our doctors, our APRNs, our nurses, everybody. But once you are able to put that process in place, it becomes very easy to actually enroll patients in clinical trials and do it, because in fact, in my mind, once a patient is on a clinical trial and you have the machinery which works very well, it is actually much easier for the patients on clinical trials to be managed than patients otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Kapur. And I'm going to go ahead and read you a comment and a question that they're somewhat related. So again, this was to your question about some of the challenges or barriers. One of the comments is getting the provider buy-in to refer a patient to a trial within our own office, and how can we combat that, which is something that it seems like you addressed. You can expand upon that. And then also from the separate participant, can you discuss how you encourage physicians who are balancing standard of care with trials, being overwhelmed, keeping up with the science? Also, how can you think about practice finances and patient out-of-pocket expenses and how they impact these decisions?
Well, so those are a lot of questions. So the first one, well, let's look at it this way. How do you encourage physicians? Well, with so many new medicines coming on in oncology, I think as an oncologist, you will be left behind if you don't stay ahead of what's coming. How do you stay ahead is by having clinical trials and research, because now you already know about some of these medicines that are in phase 1B, phase 2, and then phase 3 coming out. And it's actually very gratifying when you see that the trials that you had participated in were reported in the national journals. So a practice like ours, we were one of the very high accruers in a trial for an immunotherapy in stage 3 lung cancer. And one of our doctors was listed in the New England Journal of Medicine. So I have an abstract that is coming out in International Lung Cancer meeting. So it gives you a little, how would I put it this way? It makes you feel good about what you're doing.
Yes.
And that's one encouraging part for the clinicians. And coming to the next step that you had, which is how do you, there was a question about practice finances and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So when a patient goes on a clinical trial, actually it's very easy, because what you need to do is have the adequate infrastructure to do your budgeting process, etc. And it actually becomes much easier to manage the patients. And patients do not have any out-of-pocket expenses for clinical trials, by the way. So if you're going on a clinical trial, so the standard of care will be paid for, but anything that is not beyond standard of care is paid by the sponsor of the clinical trial, number one. And number two, if you look at, we were also part of the Medicare OCM model. Patients who went on the OCM model actually promoted people to go on clinical trials. Why? Because the cost is paid for by the study sponsor, whether it's a pharmaceutical company or whatever have you. So Medicare actually likes people to go on clinical trials in second, third line settings.
Thank you, Dr. Kapur. And we have two more questions, then we'll go on to the next slide.
Sure.
One is, and you addressed the screening. I think that was very educational. You made the comment about when a patient comes in, they're screened to see if they're eligible for any trials. And I think that's really powerful, because again, that's one of the greatest myths that I've heard. I literally have to do calls this week with various pharma partners where, and other, not just pharma, other nonprofits, where they're saying, why don't the community oncologists talk to patients about clinical trials? And I said, they do. They do, and you describe that. But one of the direct questions is, does your practice use any tools to screen and follow patients? And then just to give you another two-parter, when you were mentioning the different types of trials, you also mentioned just-in-time trials.
Yes.
So can you possibly answer those too?
Absolutely. So just-in-time trials are, a patient goes and gets, let's say in my practice, we have, 30-odd trials open, but a patient goes and gets a tissue sample done for molecular markers or targets, and they find a target on the patient's tissue. Unfortunately, we may not have a clinical trial open for that patient, but they have a marker and there's a medication available for that marker, whether it's an approved medication or whether it's a clinically a medication in clinical trials. So just-in-time trials they are open for single patients. So a patient is diagnosed with something and the trial is not open, but there is a medication available and you have a study sponsor and all available. And you can open a trial for 1 or 2 patients just for that specific patient. And I'll give you a very, very, very gratifying example for our practice. During the COVID crisis, Dana-Farber was having a hard time opening clinical trials. And they had a patient who with lung cancer who had a very specific mutation, and they wanted to put the patient on a clinical trial that was a just-in-time trial. So guess what? We had a relationship with Dana-Farber. They are probably 90 or 100 miles away from where we are.
Yes.
And they told the patient and they called us actually and said, hey, listen, it'll take us 6 months to open a clinical trial, but we know you can open this trial in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Can we send this patient to you? So we opened the clinical trial for that one patient for Dana-Farber in the just-in-time. And I think as we move forward with better molecular diagnostics, it will be so much easier to start doing just-in-time clinical trials. They are a little more work, but at the same time, this is personalized medicine at its best, because now you found a target and there's a medicine for the target and you're using it for that one patient. And it is tumor agnostic, meaning it could be for lung cancer, it could be for colon cancer, it could be for any cancer, as long as you have that mutation. And that's what some of these just-in-time trials are doing.
And we opened up by talking about the value of community oncology, and clinical trials ties into the value of community oncology. And I think of how much hope you must have given that patient. Like, it's so easy, to talk about the 17 million cancer survivors, but at that moment when you did that just-in-time trial, anybody who's doing that, that's so incredible and so uplifting for the patient.
It obviously worked because the patient was driving from Boston or the suburbia of Boston to us every 3 weeks as part of the study. And so in 6 months, Boston opened up the trial and we transferred the patient back to them.
That's incredible. Okay, and we're going to advance to the next slide, but I do want, we got one more interesting question, and this is again an educational summit, is an educational chat. The question was, is this the same as a decentralized trial?
Well, I think there was another question that I'll answer. In fact, I should have answered that. Somebody had mentioned, do you use any tools for identifying patients for clinical trials? Yes, we do. We have we have OncoEMR as our EMR, and as part of that, we have Onco Trials that we use to identify patients, number one. Number two, like I said, how we have put in this in our practice that every new chemo start, every change in therapy, every new patient will be screened for whatever clinical trials are currently available. And then, we are able to go talk to our research director right away. Once you are sending your NGS testing and also they are aware of looking for the NGS testing result and matching patients to the clinical trials that may be open for them. And then there was one more question that you had, Rose, that you were asking.
The decentralized trial.
So yes, exactly. So this is actually kind of like decentralized and tumor agnostic. And once you start doing them, I tell you, your doctors will be absolutely thrilled because they will know that they are able to get the same medications for the patients that some of these tertiary centers are doing. Now, I'm not saying that we should be doing all trials. Like I said, phase 1 trials are hard. We don't do any stem cell trials. We don't do any CAR T trials yet. But with the new CAR Ts coming out that will be coming out soon, we probably will be doing some of those things as well. But yes, these are kind of like kind of like I would not call them classically the decentralized ones, because they're still centralized, because you're controlling the data and you are providing the data on the patient to the centralized agency, but they are not controlled centrally, except some entities controlling the just-in-time.
Thank you, Dr. Kapur. And just for educational purposes, you mentioned EMR, and for those of you who don't work in oncology practice, that's an abbreviation for electronic medical records. So on this slide, Dr. Kapur, this was just a sampling, and I'm always encouraging all of you to visit the website of whoever our guest is, and because you can learn a lot more. We can only pack so much into our little speed time frame. But this is just a sampling of some of the trials that are being offered at your practice. And I actually have a question, Dr. Kapur. So does this vary like from year to year, month to month? Is this the decision? One of the questions I get as the advocacy director, and I actually got this question yesterday, was how do community oncologists decide what trials they're going to choose? And I explained to them, as COA, we are an organization that represents community oncologists all across the country, and each practice is making their own decision. So right now you have 6 like disease-specific types and then some screening and supportive care. So can you talk a little bit about that and how it varies over the years?
Well, absolutely. I think, what we do in our practice is we look for needs. So we look at what are our top cancers, breast cancer, colon cancer, prostate cancer, lung cancer. So we look for trials for those, whether it's in metastatic disease setting, first-line disease setting, second-line progressive disease, adjuvant for colorectal, and now with lung in the adjuvant setting as well. So we will look at all those and fill in the gaps for our patients. If there is a clinical trial open, then you will make sure that you enroll the patient or ask the patient if they want to be enrolled in. If there is no clinical trial open, or there's a just-in-time trial that we can open for them, we'll do that as well. But just-in-time trials are going to be done only for metastatic disease patients. They're not currently available for adjuvant and neoadjuvant patients.
I think too, for as a cancer survivor, I think that that's really incredible, because I know every cancer survivor, our greatest fear is a cancer, not just getting a new cancer, but your cancer coming back, and to know that there's again hope to try another trial. And even if it doesn't work for you personally or for the patient, again, it's just something, again, that's the value of patients, is, having something to be hopeful for. Dr. Kapur, we have 2 more questions for you.
Sure.
Do you find that laboratories are helping in different ways, assisting in clinical trial matching? Is the first question.
Oh yeah. I mean, if you do an NGS testing, most of the time you will have the NGS testing report that will come out will show you that these are the mutations that the patient has, and these may be the trials that are open for the patient. So that can help. And then the other thing we also do is, if you get the results on a patient, we will put it in a database and start matching them based on where the clinical trials may be available. But that's how you find out. So the labs, especially for the NGS testing, they can definitely help you identify where the clinical trials may be open. Absolutely.
And again, can you explain what NGS testing means?
Next generation sequencing.
Thank you.
Meaning you get the tissue and then you test it for 300 mutations to 350 to 400 genes, and look for any variations in them. And then you try to find out if there is a mutation that you find in any of the genes. Is there a medication that can target it? And as we are learning more and more of those mutations, we are learning more and more of combinations of medications for some of the cancers that I would have never thought I would use medicines like those for.
Thank you. And we have 2 more questions. How are patients, this is very interesting, how are patients rescanned for trials, say, for example, after progression? And then since you just talked about NGS, also if you could define some insight into solid tumor clinical trials.
So the first part is, every trial has their own requirements for scanning patients, clinical trials, for CAT scans, I would assume. Everything is done so let's look at it this way. Every cancer, you have a standard way of testing, standard way of scanning people. Most of the time when patients go on a clinical trial, they'll be scanned more than they would be in the standard of care. So every trial has their own specifications as to when the scan is going to be done, when they're on active clinical trial, or even when the trial has been closed, as to when the scans will be done. So that's number one. Now, the second question, Rose, was what?
Let me go back to that. Solid tumors.
So solid tumors that's where the next generation sequencing testing is very, very helpful, extremely helpful. In fact, I'll give you a simple example. I do a lot of colorectal cancer treatments, and I had a patient who progressed, sent his tissue out for special testing, found a couple of mutations on the tissue, and now he's on one medicine that we normally use for colorectal cancer, which is Vectibix, and he's on a pill with it.
Thank you. And we have another question, and then we'll go ahead and advance to the next slide. How can laboratories who do NGS testing and match a patient to a trial get in contact with community oncologists to let them know of the match?
Well, again, so that's where if you have a good relationship with a lab, the NGS testing people, whichever one you use, whether it's Caris, Foundation, Tempus, etc., a lot of times, because of those, they will be able to contact the practice right away if they find something. Otherwise, the report itself will have it highlighted, and you can do it that way too. So that's where for us, because of the OneOncology network, we've been able to do a centralized database of the NGS results that come in, and we are able to quickly match the patients based on the NGS results.
Thank you so much. Next slide, please.
There was one question, Rose. Somebody mentioned a question about scanning, about rescanning.
Oh, rescanning. Yes, rescanning.
There's something about scanning.
That's a good question. Yes. What happens if they progress? Do you rescan for clinical trials?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Oh yeah, absolutely. If a patient, depending on the clinical trial eligibility, you are able to put patients into subsequent clinical trials as long as they meet the eligibility criteria for the clinical trial.
Thank you. And again, I keep getting back to hope. That gives patients so much hope. So Dr. Kapur, when you and I were talking at the beginning, you mentioned that we've known each other for a long time. And I'm here in this picture with a colleague and the most incredible person, one of the most impactful persons in my life. Many of you know, because I've shared it many times, I was that scared patient, going into a cancer center 18 years ago with a 6-year-old child at home and an 8-year-old son, a son and daughter, 35-year-old husband. And I was very overwhelmed. And it really surprises people to learn, especially because they know me in my current role as a national advocacy director. They think that I was searching for clinical trials, and I somehow ended up, no. If it wasn't for this incredible physician, Dr. Paul, I would not have known about clinical trials. At that time, I was under the age of 40, so I was not in the category of a cancer patient. And really, one of the questions that I get all the time is, how do patients find clinical trials? And the answer oftentimes is just Googling. But it's so overwhelming. If you Google clinical trials, it's so overwhelming because there's massive amounts of data. So what I'm hoping you're all getting out of this conversation today is it is that physician-patient connection. Because even though I didn't know one word about clinical trials, I was not looking for clinical trials, I was too overwhelmed and scared at the time. But here I have a physician who's Dr. Kapur's colleague who says, you have this rare subtype, there's a clinical trial called Herceptin, and I trusted her completely. Of course, I did all these things like, review the informed consent procedure and process, and everything like Dr. Kapur described, everything goes through stages for clinical trials. So again, I just think this physician-patient contact is so important. And Dr. Kapur, did you want to say anything about all your other colleagues who are offering their patients clinical trials?
Well, I think the first thing I'll say is about Jaga. I call her Jaga because she is still the Jaga is like this Benjamin Button of oncology.
Yes.
And she was she's one heck of a clinician to begin with, and she was one of my mentors when I was here when I first started. And she's one of the most patient people that you'll ever meet.
Yes.
I don't think I've ever seen her angry in my life, which is unusual, because I can irritate many people, but I couldn't irritate her. And she was so interested in doing breast cancer research that she was able to get this clinical trial, and she was our lead with NSABP and ECOG in doing clinical trials as well. Along with that, Dennis Slater, who I, like I said, started the practice, has been totally engaged in clinical trials. He is now going to be taking a deeper role because he's coming a little away from clinical practice. So he will actually take a deeper role in our clinical research department. And he's actually doing a course in molecular diagnostics and personalized medicine. So he and our research director are doing a 1-year course in those to bring to our practice. So it's a graduate level course, and they both are doing it. So that is the kind of commitment that you need. We have Dr. Yang and Dr. Johnson, who both are experts in breast cancer. And Dr. Johnson does palliative care as well, instituting some of those. Dr. Dhami does thrombosis and hemostasis, and he's bringing in new clinical trials in that. I do, GI and immunotherapies. Dr. Nick, who's our youngest colleague, he does a lot of head and neck and lung cancer management. And we are putting, we just bought a minus 80-degree freezer because we are starting vaccine clinical trials. And in fact, we were the first one in the country to consent a patient for a vaccine trial for colorectal cancer. So what I'm trying to say is you don't have to be a huge organization to really be able to offer these to your patients. If there's a will to doing it and there's a commitment from the doctors, from the staff, it's a whole team that has to do it, not just the doctors. Doctors can't force it in. You have to bring that culture into the practice, to the nurses, to the front office, to the lab, to the research department, to your APRNs, and everyone in between to really have that mindset for doing clinical trials. And I can tell you, once you start doing clinical trials, it's like an addiction. You want to get more of those trials back into your practice. In fact, every patient who should come into the practice, there should be some sort of a mechanism that they can be enrolled into a clinical trial.
I think that's incredible. And I also want to take a minute to thank our audience for participating and for your great questions for Dr. Kapur. And so for some of your very kind comments, both to Dr. Kapur and I, we really appreciate your engagement. And Dr. Kapur, again, ECHO has been recognized as one of the top 2 practices in the state, and you just shared all the reasons why. It's just really incredible. And we just have 2 more slides left, and thank you for staying with us. I know we're going a little bit over, but this is such great conversation. Dr. Kapur, I just put some thought bubbles up here for you because these are just some common questions that have been around clinical trials for quite a while, and maybe you can just pick 1 or 2 to address before we go on to our last slide.
So I'll approach the what is the drug approval process? That's perfect because that's how drugs get approved because of clinical trials. So phase 1 is safety of a medication. Phase 1B is safety and efficacy, and then phase 2 is efficacy. Phase 3 is comparing it to the standard of care, and if it is better than standard of care and it is safe, then that medicine most likely will get approved for various disease states. Can I quit a clinical trial? Absolutely. This is an informed consent. It is voluntary. You don't have to participate in a clinical trial if you don't want to, or if you participate in it and you don't like it, you can quit. There's okay. The chance of getting a placebo, depending on whatever clinical trial you're on. Even I don't know when a patient goes on a clinical trial, if it is a phase 3, whether it is now the placebo ones are very small nowadays because most of the trials will have a comparator arm versus a new medication. So the placebo one chances are going to be much less. But when we used to have the placebo ones, I did not know who's going to get placebo and who's not going to get, who's getting the active drug, because that's what the clinical trial is all about. I should be blinded, so I'm not biased in my evaluation of a patient.
Dr. Kapur, thank you. Earlier you mentioned that we got a question from the audience about the cost, and you said there's no cost to patients. Now you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but again, when I was that cancer patient being offered a Herceptin trial, I got on the Herceptin trial, and again, that was, I didn't have any additional cost to my standard treatment. But what I learned later in my later years getting involved in advocacy is at the time, the cost of Herceptin, and at that time when I was on the trial, it was 52 treatments. And the cost was $52,000 a year, which is really staggering.
It's more than that now.
Yes, I figure it's way more than that now. So next slide, please. And thank you, Dr. Kapur. So Dr. Kapur, can you talk to us about how you're continuing to grow, not just as individual physicians? You just gave a great example about Dr. Slater, who started the practice and is still all these years later continuing to grow and learn as a physician and as a leader. and talk about your new leadership role with OneOncology, and explain a little bit about who OneOncology is and what this means for, again, expanding clinical research and
absolutely. So, OneOncology is a really a physician-driven network of practices throughout the country now. We have practices in New York, Tennessee, a couple of practices in Tennessee, Texas, California, most likely the Midwest. We also have practices in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, our practice here in Connecticut. And we are one of the smaller practices in OneOncology. And one of the attractions for us was that by having this huge network of practices, we can actually attract study sponsors to give us access to the latest and the early phase clinical trials for our patients. And that has been the biggest draw for us and for the sponsors, because we have a huge network which works together. And 1R, which is the research arm of OneOncology, is helping support that mission. So we have trials that are going through OneOncology, which are vetted by all of us. And 1R is able to provide the support in data monitoring, data gathering, etc. And then each practice does whatever needs to be done at the practice specific side. So as part of that, we worked with Roche Genentech, and I think OneOncology has accrued 40% of the patients to the basket trial, which is for molecular, for patients who have any mutation that can be targeted as long as there's a medication available, known as a basket trial. And out of those 40%, I think ECHO enrolled, I think, a quarter of those patients.
That's incredible. This has been so educational, Dr. Kapur. Thank you. And again, I'm going to share this with the audience, since it is Dr. Kapur and I do have a very personal connection. This month, May, is actually 18 years of my survivorship of when I actually started my cancer treatment. So thank you to all the doctors who do what you do. Even though I'm a long-term survivor, I still remember, like every other cancer patient, some who are on this phone call right now, what it feels like to be so overwhelmed and scared and looking to your oncologist to help guide you. So it's a very special month. It's a very special week. It's Mother's Day. My husband's been by my side. This weekend, we're celebrating our 33rd anniversary. And I really applaud all of you oncologists who take care of so many patients. But when we're right in front of you, you remember that we truly are a very vulnerable, scared patient. So thank you, Dr. Kapur, for taking time out of your day for sharing your knowledge, for being a great colleague and a great friend. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Rose, and thank you as usual. And hey, just make sure we keep on encouraging people for clinical trials. And congrats to you. And, I can just clap for you.
Thank you. I'm a little emotional. Thank you, Dr. Kapur, so much. We have one more slide. And thank you. And like Dr. Kapur said, you could always quote a clinical trial. I got a little bit cheery, so I might end up with a black eye with my scare running. Sorry, I got a little emotional with when you call Dr. Jaga Benjamin Button. She doesn't age. She looks incredible. Thank you. I'm squinting at the screen. I will see you next month, where we have an incredible guest, another amazing survivor named Judy Pearson, who wrote a book on the cancer survivorship movement. Thank you. And I'm not kidding. I'm really trained up now. Thank you, Dr. Bird. Thank you, audience. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
I keep it real. Bye. Thank you.